Greetings. Today we're going to try and create our own classes. Prior to this, we've created objects using classes given to us from the Java API. So we want to create our own classes today. What are our objectives? We want to be able to implement, whenever we see the word implement, that means write code, for our own Java classes. This is going to go into a .java source file. In this source file, we're going to have to be able to create instance variables, also known as instance fields. We're going to have to be able to create constructors used to create our objects, and also to create methods. Methods are how we're going to communicate with our objects. Each of those can have access modifiers. There are several in Java, but we're primarily going to use public and private, so we want to know the differences for each, and also how to select data types for instance variables and methods. Let's think back to our objects. Brief review. Objects are created based on the template defined in some class. Objects are instances of some class of object. There may be a student class, which we'll create today, and we may want to model a specific student with a specific name, ID, etc. We've also used rectangles or other classes that we've created objects from the Java API. So when we download Java, we get lots of classes that we can create objects, and we can also extend the language by creating our own classes. Remember, we said objects have state. That's what the objects remember. And objects have behavior. Behavior is how we communicate with it. What methods can we call? What procedures can we call that have access to that same data? Okay, we want to define a class. Class files are going to be the templates that we're going to use for our objects. When we said rectangle box equals new rectangle, we said new rectangle is the object we want to make. Rectangle is the template. Rectangle defines how the class is going to work. Rectangle came in the Java API when we downloaded Java. And today we're going to define our own classes. We're going to create a student class today. Each public class has to be defined in a file named exactly the same as the class name with a .java extension. Remember, in Java, case matters. Use the accepted naming convention. Our classes are going to begin with uppercase letters. Our methods and our instance variables, in fact, all of our variables are going to begin with lowercase letters, with the exception of finals or constants. The class contents, what we're going to put in that file, is enclosed in the following: public class, and then you put whatever class name you're going to create, a begin curly brace, then the contents, then our closing curly brace. What goes into our class file? This is our student.java or rectangle.java or whatever class we're going to implement. We have three things. Instance variables, again also known as instance fields. That's going to implement the state of our object. That's going to have our name and number of classes we've taken, etc. Things that the object is going to know. We're going to create constructors. That's going to be the code. Usually it's going to initialize our instance variables based on user data given to us in parameters. And then finally we're going to include methods. Methods implement behavior. Now, the compiler really doesn't care what order you add these in. Some people put instance variables at the bottom of our file. I'm going to assume that we're going to put our instance variables at the top, then our constructors, and then our methods. This is just a convention, but it's best to group all your instance variables together, your constructors together, and all your methods together. Okay, the three things. First, we're going to talk about instance variables. Instance variables are defined inside of a class but outside of any constructor or method. So if you declare an instance variable but it's inside of a method, it's not an instance variable. We also want to keep to a minimum the number of instance variables. We want just the variables we need to have our object remember. Instance variables are the variables that the object remembers. It's going to remember the values of those variables for as long as that object lives. On the other side, local variables or parameter variables get forgotten as soon as that method or the constructor ends. So instance variables are a big deal. They have an access specifier, public or private, could be others, but we're primarily going to use public and private. Typically, we're going to say most of our instance variables should be declared as private. They also have a data type. Here we have a string, could be an int or a student or whatever type we want. And then finally a name. Again, the variable name is going to start with a lowercase letter, and optionally it could have initialization code, private string name equals some string, but need not have it. Again, usually defined as private. We recommend that you keep your instance variables private. Next we have our constructor. Constructors define what happens to that object when our end user first creates the object using the new operator. We saw that last time. The constructor has to have the exact same name as the class name. It has no return type, unlike instance variables. And usually the function of it, it's used to take the values from the user. That's going to be the parameters, the things inside the parentheses, and usually it's going to store them in the instance variable fields. Here's a possible constructor for the student class. The parameter is named aname, and it's of type string. So if I said student stu equals new student and pass it a string Fred, Fred would be an aname. We want to take whatever was passed to us inside the constructor. We'll know that by the name aname, because that's the parameter name. And we're going to assign it. We're going to take the thing on the right and put it into the place on the left. Name here is an instance variable. Methods. Methods define what happens when an end user manipulates the object. The end user, usually the program with the main method, is going to manipulate our object with some object name.method name call. It may take values from the user, the parameters, and it may return a single value. That's a return type with a return statement, or it could be declared as void. So it may return something but need not. If it returns something, and it's also usually declared as public. If it returns something, the return type will be public return data type. If it's not going to return anything, we'd say public void, and then we'll have the method name, whatever we want to call it. In the parentheses will be a parameter list. The parameter list is a series of 0 or more parameters. Each parameter has a data type and a name. The parameter list, the pairs are separated by commas. And then in the method, we're going to have our code that uses the parameters, and it can also use the instance variables, and it could also declare additional local values. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Here our student class is going to have a method called getName. It is going to return a type of string, and what it's going to return is the name of our student. The way it returns it is with a special language structure called return. So return name will return whatever the object remembers at this point based on what's in the value of the variable called name. Here's a method that does not return a value. public void set name. Notice that this one has no return statement. In fact, it can't have a return statement because we've declared it to be void, so it's not going to return anything. It does, however, have a parameter similar to what we saw in our constructor. Here, if we want to set the name of our student, we're going to pass it a string, and we're going to take that string that's stored in a name and put it into our instance variable called name. Here's a simple class template you can use for all of your classes. Public class, replace the class name with whatever you want to name your class, maybe student. Then include your instance variables. Next, make them private, usually. It'll have a data type like string and a variable name like name. You can also optionally put an equals some value if you choose. So put a list of the instance variables there. Next, define your constructors. Public. Now the constructor name has to match the name of the class name. Public student, and then a parentheses, and then the parameter list. Again, the parameter list is a comma-separated list of parameters. Each parameter has a data type and a name. Inside of the constructor, you have a begin left curly brace, begin brace, then the code, then an end brace. And finally, put your methods. Usually you want to make your methods public so our end users can access them. It can have a data type like int, string, or student, whatever. Or it could be void, followed by the method name and our optional parameter list. I say optional parameter list. The parentheses are required, but the parameters, we can have 0 parameters if we choose. So that's a simple class template, but you can use that for any of the classes that you create. Okay, let's get down and try something in Eclipse. Our next tutorial, we're going to download that template. We're going to create an Eclipse Java project and use that template to create a student class.